On October 1st, 1955, the freight cars stopped at the border station and the doors slid open with the flat scrape of iron on iron. Hans von Baukow waited for the shout that never came. Men climbed down into gentle light, blinking as if the sky itself were unfamiliar. Hans stepped last, counting under his breath, because counting had once been the only way to stay alive. When his boots hit the platform, the wood felt springy, and the softness made his stomach tighten, as if comfort were a trick. A clerk pointed the returnees toward buses for Friedland, the transfer camp that West German newspapers had turned into a promise. The clerk's finger tapped his clipboard, 3 quick taps, a pause, just to keep the line moving. The rhythm hooked into Hans's body. His shoulders rose into the posture of roll call before he could think his way out of it, and it meant that he stood too straight among men trying to look like civilians. The buses had picked them up at Herleshausen, where photographers leaned in to capture the late returners climbing from freight cars. A flash popped. Men lifted hands to shield their faces. Hans did not lift a hand. The white burst of light became, for an instant, the flare of a signal lamp in snow, the kind used to mark a work detail moving toward a pit. So he held perfectly still, as if stillness could make him invisible. But it meant that the camera froze that stillness into an image the country could consume, a proof of survival that felt like theft. At Friedland, a practical bell rang to announce the transport. Families pressed behind barriers, waving flowers and photographs of younger faces. Hans did not search for anyone. His wife had been told to wait until his name was confirmed. He listened to the bell's vibration in his ribs and felt it become something else. Tapping on rock in a shaft, a signal passed hand to hand when voices were dangerous. In that moment, his feet refused the first step into the registration hall. A uniformed West German guard, courteous and unarmed, touched his elbow and guided him as if he were unsteady, and the price was the bitterness of needing guidance in a country that called him returned. In the medical room at Friedland, a nurse unwrapped his feet. The skin was pale and scarred where frostbite had once tried to take it. The nurse made a sympathetic sound and wrote a note. Hans watched the pencil move and felt the old resentment rise. The camp had taken his flesh in exchange for time, and now time was being logged like inventory. So he answered the nurse's questions in monosyllables. But it meant that when the nurse said, almost tenderly, "You are home," the word home landed in his chest like an accusation. Inside, the process was meant to return men to normal life by paperwork. Clerks called names. Lists were pinned in neat columns. When Hans von Baukow appeared on paper, Hans touched the ink as if it might be scraped away. The ink held. Relief should have followed. Instead, his mouth produced the wrong language, a rough Russian camp slang word that had once meant, "Give me food." A clerk blinked, then pretended not to hear, and the consequence was humiliation that felt like a collar. They gave him a stamped cardboard card as proof he had been processed, and he folded it into his pocket like contraband. In the train compartment south, a man unfolded a newspaper and read about Chancellor Adenauer's Moscow trip, about diplomacy that had released the last 10,000. Hans watched the photograph and tried to insert his own body into the story the country wanted. It meant that he felt like cargo being tallied. The downside was that anger rose in him with nowhere safe to go. He arrived in a town that smelled of bread and machine oil. Marta stood at the platform's end, hands clasped, her smile careful, as if sudden joy might shatter something. Hans walked toward her and stopped at a polite distance because closeness felt like a trap. She stepped in anyway and touched his sleeve. As a result, he let himself be guided home like someone learning doors again, and the cost was the stiffness in his body under her touch, a stiffness she pretended not to feel. Their living room was bright, arranged as if for a photograph. Marta had set soup, bread, pickles, proof they were no longer starving. Hans sat and stared at the carpet. The floral lines became cracks in frozen ground near Beketovka, the transit camp outside Stalingrad, where he had first learned that a man could be reduced to a number. That meant the room drifted away from its own address. Even so, it meant that he could not lift the spoon. The spoon clicked once against the bowl. Hans's fingers closed around it until his knuckles whitened. In his head, the click became the gentle sound before a shot, a bolt being pulled back. In turn, his breath stopped, then returned in shallow gulps. But the consequence was Marta's face, the smile sliding away into confusion she could not name. Twice in the first month he woke in the middle of the night standing in the hallway with no memory of leaving the bed. Once he found himself in the kitchen with the bread knife in his hand, blade angled downward as if awaiting inspection. So he forced himself to set the knife down and grip the countertop until the trembling passed. The downside was Marta waking to the scrape of his breath and understanding, without being told, that his sleep had become another battlefield. Marta tried to involve the town's welfare office, the quiet post-war machinery meant to help the returning men find work and housing. A clerk asked Hans to fill out forms and describe his service. Hans stared at the boxes and lines until the paper blurred into a camp list. When he tried to speak, Russian camp phrases pushed through again, harsh and hungry. The clerk's eyes widened, then softened with pity. In turn, the clerk spoke to Marta instead of Hans. The consequence was Hans felt himself erased in real time, a man watching his own citizenship be administered to someone else. Later, Marta kept the Friedland papers in a folder with clipped articles about the last transport, as if documentation could hold him steady. Hans saw only rectangles of ink. Dates, October 1955, January 1956, floated without meaning, and that emptiness frightened him more than memory. That night she offered him a feather pillow. Hans pushed it aside and found a red brick by the stove, left over from repairs. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it under his head. The hardness was familiar enough to let his body relax. But it also meant that Marta watched him choose masonry over comfort and understood without words that her home could not soften him. In the weeks that followed, he built rules instead of recovery. No radio after dusk, no metal clatter at the table, a brick in the bed, the garden gate oiled so it would not squeal. Each rule produced a brief calm. But the cost was that the rules turned Marta into a keeper of procedures, checking spoons and doors as if she lived in a place that punished mistakes. In 1956, the paper spoke of new uniforms again, NATO membership, then the formation of the Bundeswehr. Hans did not read the articles, but he saw the headlines on shop counters and felt his skin crawl. He told himself work would anchor him. Work would prove the war had ended. As a result, he followed a notice to a small mechanical factory. The foreman led him between lathes and presses. The roar was constant, but the floor was ruled by punctuated strikes. Hammer blows, punch presses, steel on steel. Each strike landed in Hans's body like coded knocking. Someone dropped a metal bar. The clang snapped something open inside him. He did not remember deciding to move. He only remembered his hands searching for weight, for a tool, for anything that meant survival. As a result, he seized a length of pipe and held it like a shovel handle. But it meant the foreman's shout turned, in Hans's mind, into Russian, and Hans swung at empty air where he believed a guard stood. The pipe hit a bench, tools clattered. 2 men pinned him and forced him out into daylight. When the noise stopped, shame arrived like nausea. The foreman gave him his papers back and told him to go home and rest. Hans heard dismissal instead of kindness. He walked home by side streets, avoiding children and windows, and the consequence was the town began to feel like a corridor with no exits. On his way back from the factory, he passed a shop window displaying a poster with a young man in a crisp uniform and the word Bundeswehr printed in bold. The promise was order, protection, a fresh start. Hans stopped, unable to decide whether the poster was the future or a replay. It meant that he turned his face away and kept walking because looking too long felt like volunteering. The penalty was that he began to fear his own country's normal noises as much as he had feared the camps. By 1958, Hans had learned to hide his worst hours. He ate quickly and silently. He slept with the brick. He avoided the radio. He repaired fences and sharpened tools because usefulness kept neighbors from asking questions. So life appeared orderly from the street. But it meant his order depended on constant vigilance, and vigilance never let him stop being a prisoner. In the months before the shed roof repair, Marta began finding small proofs of missing time. Once she discovered the brick pillow had been replaced with a second brick, stacked like a bunk bed, as if hands had prepared for another body. Another time she found black grit under his fingernails, though he had not been in the garden that day. Hans had no explanation. He could not even remember the question. So Marta started locking away certain tools quietly, as if hiding them from a child. In exchange, it meant that Hans noticed the locks and interpreted them as containment, and containment always demanded resistance or submission. Otto, the neighbor, was a veteran too, returned earlier, better practiced at forgetting. He did not ask about Russia. He talked about potatoes and weather and the price of coal. It meant that Hans could stand at the fence and breathe, but it meant Otto's patience became a mirror, and Hans hated the man reflected there. Otto invited him once to a meeting of a returnees association in the back room of a tavern. Men sat with coffee and cigarettes and spoke in careful sentences about paperwork, pensions, and the Moscow Agreement, as if diplomacy were a rope that had pulled them out. One man produced a pamphlet explaining how to apply for compensation and read aloud a paragraph about reintegration. As a result, Hans felt his throat close. The word reintegration sounded like a command to become whole on schedule. The price was that he left abruptly, stepping into the street where the tavern's piano music followed him like a pursuit. One afternoon, Otto asked Hans to help repair a shed roof. Hammer, nail, hammer. The rhythm was steady and small. Hans's throat tightened anyway. Steady rhythm could become marching cadence, work gang tempo, the knock on a bunker door. As a consequence, Hans began to miss nails, his blows landing wrong, but it meant a surge of anger had no target, and in that anger, Otto's face sharpened into the face of someone waiting for him to fail. Hans excused himself and went into his own yard, telling himself he would plant potatoes. He took a shovel. The wooden handle was smooth, the blade heavy. The weight calmed him. He drove the blade into earth near the back fence with a force that surprised him. The shovel struck stone with a dull thud, and the yard slipped sideways. As a result, he dug deeper, not for potatoes but for space, for air, for escape. The cost was that the digging followed a different program. Clear, lift, throw, check, the sequence of a collapsed passage where time was measured in oxygen. His pocket brushed the stamped Friedland card. He pulled it out and saw the date, the proof of return. For a moment it anchored him. Then the stamp blurred into mud, and in his mind the card became a ration ticket with a number, 280, issued by a system that handled prisoners like inventory and sent them to labor in mines far north of any map he had owned. It meant that the number rose in his mouth, but it meant he swallowed it and felt it lodge in his throat, hard and immovable. The memory arrived as pressure, not narrative. There had been a collapse. Timber snapped. A tunnel folded. Men were buried where they stood. Guards had sent Hans in with others because Hans still moved fast when ordered. The sentence had been simple. Clear the passage. If someone blocks the way, remove him. In turn, Hans's muscles in the yard tightened into obedience. The consequence was the word remove was never neutral again. He began tapping the shovel blade against stone, 3 taps and a pause, listening as if the earth might answer. The sound carried over the fence. Otto heard it and came through the gate, hands open, voice gentle. He called Hans's name. Hans did not answer. Otto stepped closer and placed a light hand on Hans's shoulder. In Hans's body, touch during work had only ever meant correction, an order, a push toward danger. That meant Hans jerked away and swung the shovel handle up. The downside was that it struck Otto across the ribs with blunt wood, and Otto folded to his knees with a shocked exhale that sounded to Hans like a man losing air underground. Marta ran out at the sound. She saw Otto bent over, saw Hans with the shovel, and for a heartbeat her mind refused the scene. Then she grabbed Hans's arm and pulled. Hans resisted with the rigid strength of someone refusing to be dragged. The shovel fell and thudded into dirt. The penalty was blood on Otto's lip and bruising already blooming under his shirt, proof the town would not unsee. That evening Otto was taken to a clinic. Marta washed the shovel and put it back in the shed as if returning an animal to its cage. She did not call the police at once. She told herself Otto would not want scandal, that records would make everything worse. As a result, Hans remained at home, unarrested, unexamined. But the consequence was home tightened into confinement, built from her fear and his shame. The clinic doctor said Otto had cracked ribs and would be sore for weeks. Otto's wife stood in the doorway of their house and looked at Hans as if he were still swinging. Hans lifted his hand in a half gesture that might have been apology, might have been salute, then let it fall. So he did not enter the house because entry would require words, but it meant the unspoken apology curdled into something else inside him. Proof, he told himself, that he was now a danger who had to be managed like a dangerous job. He went to the hardware store the next day and bought a second padlock. The shopkeeper asked casually what he needed it for. Hans said, for the cellar. And the lie felt thin. In turn, the shopkeeper nodded and did not ask again. The penalty was the way the man's eyes tracked Hans's hands, as if expecting them to do something sudden, the same wariness the camp guards had worn, but without the weapons. That night, Hans scrubbed the yard shovel again, though it was already clean, rubbing until his palms were raw. It meant rawness brought him a kind of relief, because pain was familiar currency. But the consequence was that when Marta offered salve, he flinched as if kindness were another kind of pressure. Rain arrived before dawn, tapping the windows in soft, regular beats. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Hans listened until the pattern became the mine signal. That meant he rose and went to the basement. The price was his hands moved with certainty because a basement had a lock, and a lock meant control. He cleared the basement over the following days. Jars, furniture, old toys, everything went upstairs. He found a chain and a padlock in a toolbox. He tested the padlock's click again and again. Each click told him something could be shut and kept shut. So a faint calm appeared on his face. But it meant Marta understood his calm had nothing to do with safety. Neighbors learned about Otto's injuries anyway. People crossed the street when Hans appeared. Children were called inside. It meant fewer triggers, fewer voices. But it meant deeper isolation. And in isolation, the mind filled the empty space with its own rules. In 1960, Lukas was old enough to build whole worlds on the living room floor. He pushed a toy tank with rubber tracks over the carpet, making engine noises and sharp staccato bursts he had learned from films. The toy clicked when it bumped chair legs. Lukas laughed and repeated the click because repetition is how children learn. Lukas had received the toy tank as a birthday gift from an uncle who liked to say the country had to be strong again. The tin box still sat on a shelf, printed with a smiling boy and a slogan about adventure. Hans had not thrown the box away. He had hidden it, as if hiding the words could change what they meant. So Lukas found the tank anyway, because children discover what adults try to bury. But it meant the gift carried into their living room the era's new confidence about soldiers and machines. Hans tried to stay outside, to mend tools and work the garden, to keep his hands busy on tasks with clear ends. In turn, Lukas learned to play quietly when his father was near. The penalty was that quiet did not protect them, because the danger was not volume but pattern. On a warm afternoon, a neighbor's radio drifted through open windows with talk of defense, responsibility, the new army the country was raising in a divided Europe. Hans did not stand to listen, yet the cadence reached him anyway. As a result, he began to pace in his kitchen, following the rhythm as if it were drill. The consequence was Marta's recognition, instant, wordless, that the day's balance had shifted again. Lukas rolled the tank up a cushion like a hill and announced it was taking a position. Hans heard position and taking, and his mind did what it had been trained to do. Search for threat, search for rules, Search for what keeps air in the lungs. The living room narrowed, furniture rising like tunnel walls. This left a tremor in Hans's hands, but it meant that he could not find a way to stop what he felt coming. Marta reached for his wrist, offered tea, offered errands, offered any detour. Hans did not respond. His gaze stayed on Lukas and the toy. As a consequence, Marta stepped between father and son, trying to break the line of sight. But it meant Hans, for a heartbeat, misrecognized her as the camp translator who had once rendered a guard's order into bored German, and that misrecognition stripped Marta of authority. Hans moved fast. He grabbed Lukas by the upper arm and pulled him into the hallway. Lukas yelped, startled. Marta grabbed for Hans's shoulder. Hans shrugged her off and kept moving. Lukas's toy fell and clattered on the floor. The clatter snapped the last thin thread of domestic meaning. In turn, Hans's grip tightened, as if he were holding a prisoner. The price was Lukas's first true fear of his own father. He opened the basement door and pushed Lukas down the stairs. The basement smelled of damp stone and old apples. Light from a small window cut a narrow strip across the floor. Hans shut the door and locked it. The padlock clicked. The click landed in his teeth. That meant the basement became, in his mind, a controlled environment where variables could be managed. The downside was Lukas's crying, which Hans interpreted as noise that would attract punishment. Hans went down after him and stood over the boy. He told Lukas this was not a game. He said that in the war there was no honor, only filth, frostbite, and hunger that makes men do things they cannot name. He spoke of soup that was mostly water and of bodies used as steps when a tunnel collapsed. He did not describe the worst clearly, because even in his frenzy he could not cross certain lines aloud. It meant Lukas absorbed not facts, but terror. The consequence was Hans felt for a moment powerful, and power was the most dangerous taste the camp had ever taught him. Lukas begged to go upstairs and promised anything. Hans heard promises as bargaining, and bargaining had once been the first step toward betrayal. As a result, Hans turned away from the boy's words and checked the lock again, compulsively. The cost was Lukas's trust, the assumption that a father protects fractured under pressure, quietly and permanently. Marta crouched at the top of the basement stairs, keeping her voice steady because sharpness could trigger him. She asked what he needed. She offered to take the toy away forever. Hans heard negotiation as procedure, the camp's habit of offering choices that were not real, so his suspicion increased. But it meant he began to see even Marta's kindness as a trap. She went to the kitchen phone and dialed the number she had written down months ago but never used. Her hand shook so hard she had to press digits twice. That meant the outside world entered the house through a wire. The penalty was that secrecy, her last tool, was gone, and nothing could be unmade. A patrol car arrived, then another. A voice called from the street, asking if everything was all right. Hans heard the voice through walls that became planks in a barrack. The cadence became roll call. In turn, his breathing slowed, because procedure meant a script he could follow. The cost was that his home turned in his mind into a perimeter to be held. He looked through a slit in the curtain. 2 policemen stood by the gate, hands near their belts. No rifles, yet his mind supplied them. So his body prepared for punishment, because punishment had always followed resistance. But the consequence was that he could not imagine leaving this moment except in handcuffs. The policeman called Hans's name again, slower, asking him to come out and talk. Hans did not answer with defiance. He heard translation in his head, the camp office voice turning foreign command into German. It meant relief, because he could stop improvising and return to compliance. The downside was that compliance meant abandoning the role he had wanted, husband, father. For the role his body knew, prisoner. He cracked the basement door and saw Lukas, tear-streaked and silent. Hans told him to stay still. Lukas obeyed, swallowing sobs. That meant discipline. But it meant the discipline was born from terror, not trust. Outside, more cars arrived. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their faces pale ovals. Someone whispered in the street. Hans did not hear the words, but he felt the weight of collective attention like a searchlight. As more cars arrived, boots scuffed on the pavement outside in short, controlled steps. Hans heard the scuff as marching on frozen ground. For a second, the garden hedges vanished and were replaced by low snow walls, and he smelled coal and breath again. So his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth as if the cold had returned. But it meant he could no longer tell whether he was protecting his son from the world or protecting the world from himself. Outside, a megaphone vibrated the air. "Release the child. Come out." The amplified voice reminded Hans of the Friedland bell, welcome made from metal, and the two sounds fused, arrival and arrest. As a result, his identity collapsed to the simplest unit that had always functioned. The price was that his name, printed so carefully on a Friedland list, lost its power in his mouth. Hans opened the front door and stepped onto the porch as if stepping down from a freight car. He raised his hands. The policeman approached, surprised by docility, and cuffed him. The metal clicked. What followed was surrender that felt almost orderly. The consequence was that Marta, behind him, understood he had left her and Lukas to endure the debris. Lukas was carried out wrapped in a blanket, blinking in daylight. He did not run to Marta. He stood rigid, looking at his father as if trying to decide what he was seeing. So Marta took Lukas's hand and led him inside. But it meant the stiffness in Lukas's fingers echoed the stiffness that had lived in Hans since the border platform. Hans was taken to a hospital, then to a psychiatric clinic. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. Locks were meant to keep people safe, yet Hans's body could not tell the difference. As a result, he sat on his bed with hands on knees, waiting. The consequence was that waiting became his only remaining skill. In the intake interview, a psychiatrist asked him where he thought he was. Hans looked at the man's white coat, the clipboard, the locked door, and answered with the only location his body trusted, the mine. The psychiatrist asked about episodes, about wandering, about the gaps Marta had described. Hans could not argue with the gaps. He had lived inside them. So the psychiatrist wrote a diagnosis in neat script that tried to make the chaos legible. But it also meant that once the words were written, the story risked shrinking into a clinical problem instead of the long aftershock of war. On a storm night, rain hammered the windows in hard bursts. The rhythm shifted, and Hans heard it as a mine signal, 3 taps and a pause. As a consequence, he rose and walked to a blank wall at the end of the corridor. The night nurse watched from a distance, afraid to startle him. Hans lifted his right hand in a salute, crisp and exact, and whispered a report to empty plaster. He gave his name as Captain Hans von Baukow, because that rank still sounded like dignity. Then he corrected himself and said he was reporting at mine number 280. It meant his voice steadied, as if the report itself supplied oxygen, but it meant the war, reaching across 15 years, had found a clean room in which to continue. He lowered his hand and pressed his forehead to the cool wall. He said softly that he had not climbed out yet. In the morning he sat at a table and stared at the wood grain. The lines resembled cracks in frozen earth. The resemblance was enough. So his fingers began to tap 3 times, pause, then tap again, sending a signal to no one. But it meant he would keep sending it anyway, because the body does not stop obeying a command simply because the world has changed its uniforms. Somewhere beyond the clinic walls, a church bell rang for morning service, and his fingers matched its rhythm without permission. This left a new signal tapped into an indifferent day. The downside was that survival itself kept demanding obedience.